Thank you, Jim. Chapter 5, Esther chapter 5. Sometimes when you try and put yourself in the position of the people you read about, it kind of gets interesting. Sometimes you think, man, they're crazy, I would never have done that. And then sometimes you think they did way better than I would do. And you just try and put yourself in their position. Remember at the end of chapter 4, Mordecai has challenged Esther because this decree has gone out. This decree has been taken in about a year that God's people would be the subject of genocide and execution, and it all looks bleak. Whenever it looks bleak, you know God's up to something. He's going to do something, but he does it in his way, in his time. And the book of Esther is a total picture of God's sovereign control and plans and purposes. And at the end of chapter 4, they fast. They don't eat, they don't drink for 3 days or nights. 3 seems to be somewhat of a number in Scripture. Abraham was 3 days, Jesus was 3 days, this is 3 days. There's probably more examples. But 3 days seems to be a kind of good thing for what we're going to talk about. And I just want you to put yourself in that position. She's fasted. Whether or not she prayed or not, we talked about that last week. It doesn't say she did, but lots of people think they did. So maybe she did. But she says it's against the law in the end of chapter 4. And though it's against the law, I'll go in to see the king. It's a crazy situation. I mean, you're going to see your husband. Shouldn't be that scary, right? But back in the day, I mean, imagine, ladies, if you had to go in and get permission to be in the presence of your husband, and he may or may not speak to you. I mean, that'd be good today. That would work well, wouldn't it, Nick? That'd go over well. You sitting on your little throne, and Chaco having to come and say, "Are you ready to speak to me?" No, go away. That'd go over just fantastic. And she makes this pledge to go and see the king. And I want you to think about this because it's really interesting. Sometimes we make these pledges, or sometimes we want to know the answer to something, but it's going to take some time. You might not think 3 days is that big a deal, but if God came to you and said, in 3 days, I'm going to do something, or sometimes it's Sunday, right? On Wednesday, you might have a meeting that really is something you're not looking forward to. And you know from Sunday to Wednesday, all you're thinking about is that meeting. 4 weeks ago, it wasn't a big deal because it was 4 weeks off, but the time gets closer and closer, and Wednesday's coming, and that appointment's getting closer. It may be a doctor's appointment, right? When he first gives you, it's 3 months away, so you're like, no problem. And 3 months becomes 3 weeks, and 3 weeks becomes 3 days, and 3 days becomes 3 hours, and now it's like, oh man, can we reschedule? And she's made this pledge after fasting to go, and she says it's against the law, and now I'm going to go and see the king. If I must die, I must die. It's quite an amazing statement, and you added an interesting thought, Larry, last week, which I hadn't thought of. But she makes this claim, this statement, and Mordecai goes away, and he did everything as Esther had ordered him. And so we find in chapter 5 and verse 1, on the 3rd day of the fast, Esther has been thinking about this now for 3 days. What do you think the enemy, Abraham, walked for 3 days? Abraham left early that next morning. He saddled his donkey, he takes his servants, and he starts to go for 3 days. For 3 days, the disciples had to figure out if Jesus was really dead or not. Like, he was dead, but is he coming back? 3 days is a long time, right? Think about whether it's the 3 days of Abraham walking to sacrifice Isaac, or Jesus coming back from the dead, or Esther waiting for the 3rd day to go in and see the king. What do you think the devil's ploy is? What do you think the devil wants to use those 3 days for? Fear. Fear ultimately to try and stop it from happening. If Abraham gets scared and walks away, there's a big loss there. Obviously, Jesus isn't going to get scared, but if the devil could somehow keep Jesus from rising again, that would be a massive deal. If he can stop Esther, that would be good for him because Esther's in the way of his genocide. What else is it? The devil wants to produce fear. What else does he want to do in those 3 days? Or how does he produce fear then? How does he incite fear in you?
Self-preservation,
Self-preservation, self-interest, that's good. What else?
Hope. Doubt. Killing hope.
Killing hope, doubt. And there you go. It's a mind and the heart and the spirit are the really big playing fields. So killing your thoughts, messing up your thoughts. It's one thing on Sunday to say, I'll go and see him, I'll sort it out for you, and then Wednesday comes, right? She now, on the third day of the fast, she puts on her royal robes. And I read that and I kept thinking about Jesus puts on our, we put on the righteous robes of Jesus. She's like getting ready for battle. She puts on these royal robes because that infers her some kind of status and help. But you realize that we've been dressed in white robes, right? That we've been dressed in the robes of righteousness. If her robes were making her ready for battle, how much do our robes get us ready for battle? And that's a rabbit trail that I won't go down. But I kept thinking about that when I was studying this. On the third day of the Lord, Esther put on her royal robes, and here it is. Moment comes to shove. Right? Push comes to shove. I'll get it right in the end. And she goes in the inner court of the palace. Now, God's over all of it, but the next thing that happens is literally life or death. We may never have got to that situation yet, but we might. What happens if in 3 days it's literally life or death? I mean, maybe some of us have faced that with a bad report from the doctor when you're at the hospital. They've got 2 or 3 days to live. And all of a sudden, she puts on her royal robes. And by the way, she can put on her royal robes. Well, what does that really guarantee? Nothing really. She enters the inner court of the palace. She's fasted, she's done whatever she did, and now it's here. And it's just across from the king's hall. There's this picture of the king sitting there in power and authority and sovereignty. And I couldn't help, and I don't want to belabor this, and I'm not even saying the Bible's trying to make this connection, but in my mind it made a connection. Look at Hebrews chapter 4. Do you remember Hebrews chapter 4? And here's a picture of it. Xerxes is sitting on his throne and she's scared to go in. Xerxes is sitting on his throne like he has the power and he has the authority, and you're doing me a favor if I can speak to you, and if you'll just hold out your scepter, I'm good. And yet, aren't you glad that Jesus isn't like that? Can you imagine if you went to prayer and it was like, man, if he's fed up with me, he'll just kill me. He may or may not listen to me. He may or may not care. I mean, imagine walking into the throne room of grace, so to speak, and God being like, I'm done with you. We forget how good the gospel is. We forget how good God is. We forget the picture of Isaiah, I see you high and lifted up. We forget who God is. And in verse 14 of Hebrews 4, it's famous, I won't last there long. Since we have a great high priest who has entered heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to what we believe. Jesus is sitting at the right hand of the Father because everything he's been called to do so far, he's done. He's ever making intercession. He's our intercessor. He's our advocate. The Son of God, let us hold firmly to what? Let us hold firmly to everything we believe. Because we have a great high priest, because Jesus has entered heaven, because Jesus has won, because Jesus has died, because Jesus has rose again. Hold firmly to what we believe. That's what we talked about, right? So whether it's 3 days or 7 days, hold firmly to what you believe. This high priest of ours understands our weaknesses. That's pretty important, isn't it? That God understood Esther's weaknesses is pretty important. The high priest of ours understands our weaknesses, for he faced all of the same testings we do. So when we are tested, who knows? Jesus does. Who can you talk to about it? Jesus. Who can you go to advice because they won? Jesus. He faced all of the same testings we do, yet he never did sin. And I love this. This is so different than Xerxes. This is so different than like what we see in the world. Let us come boldly. How do you come boldly to Jesus? I mean to God. How do you come boldly to God? It's only through Jesus. But Jesus gives you full access and full privilege and full right to stand in front of God. You realize good works don't get you to God, right? You realize that on your own you ain't good enough? That you can't deserve it, that you can't earn it. But when you take Christ, it's like a pass to the throne room of grace and mercy. It's a pass to, and eternally we'll live there. We'll live in the presence of God and be around his throne and all of that. But it says, let us come boldly to the throne of our gracious God. See, once you understand God's character, and once you understand God's power in your life and the authority he's given you and the access he's granted to you, it changes everything. Esther would walk in and it's kind of like 50-50, 60-40, 70-30, whatever the odds are. But the better odds are it's 100% that I'll be allowed in. You don't have to wake up tomorrow morning and say, I wonder if God's ready to speak to me today. I wonder if he'll allow me to go into his presence. You don't have to wait for eternity to find out if he'll take you or not. It says, let us come boldly. Yeah, and I messed it up at the end. I kept saying shaken. This morning I meant stirred. But if we're getting stirred, we don't have to be shaken. And to stop being shaken, we need to come boldly to the throne of our gracious God. The devil's going to say you don't need it. The devil's going to say you shouldn't want it. The devil's going to say God doesn't love you. God doesn't care. God's too busy. There's so many times that we stop from praying, from seeking God out. But he says, come boldly to the throne of our gracious God. Man, if they needed Xerxes' grace, how much more do we need God's grace? See the picture in Esther of this king, but this king is nothing. And by the way, who put this king in place? God did. And he doesn't have righteous robes. He doesn't have robes of righteousness. The robes that he'll put on Mordecai aren't anything to what God can put on us. There we will receive his mercy and we will find grace to help us when we need it the most. When nobody else is gracious, when no one else is merciful, when there's no other way, when there's no other answer, when everything looks bad, look at what he says. You might find. Imagine that. That's why you can come boldly, because you know you will find. It's not a question if you'll find it. You will find grace to help you when you need it the most. Go back to Esther chapter 5, and she enters the inner court of the palace, verse 1, just across from the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne facing the entrance. This is imagine the power and authority this guy thinks he has. You can imagine why kings thought a lot about themselves, can't you? And the king sitting on his royal throne. The mistake to make in reading this story is like, oh, this king has all the power. This king has all the authority. It's all due to this king. It's all on this king. Sometimes we think that. Sometimes we think it's on a judge, and like it's all up to this judge. Which way will he sway? No, it's not a judge. God's over all of it. What will my boss do? No, it's not your boss that has the authority. God does, every time. And this king is sitting there, Xerxes is sitting there, and it says the king was sitting on his royal throne facing the entrance. She's in place. Here's the moment. And those 3 days, do you ever suppose she thought it would be this easy? But it ended up being fairly simple. You see, lots of times we stress about stuff and it doesn't really happen, right? Let me ask you this, and that's the key. In these 3 days, that's the key. After 3 days, it's going to work out pretty good. In fact, the story goes really well from here. So really, look, if you could play Monday morning quarterback, if you could go back and be with Esther, knowing what you know now, what would you tell her? Trust me, don't worry. Don't worry about this. It's going to be good. No, it's going to be good. You can't believe what God's about to do. Haman will be no more. The Jews will be saved. God's going to do it. Here, we've talked about this, but I always want to, whether she stresses out or not, isn't really going to help or change God's mind. But what faith will do for you in that moment, like if she refuses to go in and stuff, but sometimes we're scared to death and we still do it, right? Esther gets up, she fasts, she says, if I'm going to die, I'm going to die. And she gets up, and I think in that moment there's probably some kind of trepidation. But the picture is, what did you do in those 3 days? You remember again, the apostles, where were they? They were locked up in fear of the Jews. So we can waste days worrying about something, right? The idea is for the 3 days before to have peace, to have joy, to go on about your business, to trust God, to fast, to do whatever you need to do. In verse 2, the king sees Queen Esther standing there in the inner court, and he welcomed her. Good moment, right? But why did he welcome her? Why did he marry her? Why is he doing anything? God's doing all of this. God's granted her favor. God's put her in position. This isn't like God saying, I hope this guy responds the right way, otherwise we're going to call an emergency meeting. God knows what he's going to do before he does it. God's manipulated the whole situation. And he sees Queen Esther standing there in the inner court, and he welcomes her. And here's the moment. Remember, if he doesn't hold out the scepter, what happens? You're gone. And he held out the gold scepter to her. And Esther approaches and touches the end of the scepter. Even that's an act of, humility and, you got all the... And so Esther knows from that moment that God has granted her, even though they haven't been around each other for 30 days, but to be honest, the king doesn't seem to have much animosity to Esther. But now Esther has been invited in. So the first prayer would be what? God, if I have to die, I'll die. But if he doesn't hold out that scepter, then I'm done. Well, he's held out his scepter. But do you think that then she's like, well, this is easy now? You see, once we get through one obstacle, another one, what? It comes. And this, look, I can't figure out women at the best of times. So what Esther's doing and all of that, you'll have to ask Jesus when you see him. I'll tell you what I know, which might get us out quick. The king asked her, what do you want, Queen Esther? What did she want? She wanted to get God's people safe. That's what she wanted. She wanted to rid the Jews of this law that has been enacted that can't be reversed. You have to believe that God's the God of the impossible, right? I want you to revoke a law that you can't revoke. I want you to change a law that cannot be changed. And by the way, you made the mistake. You got hoodwinked. Haman has tricked you, and you bought it, and you gave you a signet deal, and you've bought into it. And what he's going to realize is he's going to get mad at Haman, because when you realize that someone's taking you for a fool, it's not easy to handle, is it? And the king sits there and he says, what do you want, Queen Esther? There's conjecture why she's going to hold 2 banquets. She could have said everything at the first. She doesn't. Is it wise? Is it what God's saying? Is she scared? You figure it out. I've given you the options. You go home and do your homework. But look, God's over all of this, right? And whether she was scared the first time, God's going to work it out. Maybe she had a plan. Maybe it's that. I don't know what God has spoken to her. It doesn't tell us. And I find this really interesting. Another tactic of the devil is to distract you a little, right? If the devil could have distracted Abraham, and by the way, it wouldn't really take that much distraction. Well, what you're on your way to do, kill your son. Well, do you want to veer from that? Well, yeah, that'd be a good idea. The devil loves to distract us, right? I just think about this. What do you want, Queen Esther? What is your request? Obviously, the answer is, I want you to do something. I really need God to do something. I want to save my people. Now, some say this is conjecture, but I believe he'd do it. I will give it to you even if it's half the kingdom. That's how rich he is. That's how little. Remember, Haman has offered him money and he doesn't even care. He tells Haman, do what you want with it. I don't think Xerxes is struggling, and I don't think he's that bothered about money, probably because he has more than he can handle. And he tells her, you can have everything, anything up to half of the kingdom. That basically infers you can have whatever you ask for. Just stop for a minute. You've gone, and you've been granted albeit it's your husband, But you've been granted a meeting with the king, and he has offered you anything up to half of his kingdom. What's one of the biggest distractions we have in the world? Which is a master that really tries to be our master? Money. If you went to think about this. If you went to the president on the errand of changing something that needed to be changed, marriage, abortion, whatever you want to make it. If you went as a Christian to the White House and your job was to try and get something done to save people, and the president said to you, I'll give anything I have to you, at least half of what I have. Do you think that might be a bit of a distraction and a temptation? Hey, Nick, I keep picking on you, sorry. You came to do something spiritual. You can have all the money you could ever handle. Like if you just don't talk about what you're here to talk about, you can have whatever you can handle. I mean, imagine going to the White House saying, I'm going to tell them about Jesus, and then the guy turns around and says, hey, what do you want? Are we talking about Jesus, or you want half the kingdom? You know what your flesh is screaming for, don't you? I honestly think that's a challenge for her. And she's probably, look, and on one point she's probably the queen, and she is a queen, but she's got all the stuff. Maybe it isn't, but I think it's a challenge. It would be to me, wouldn't it you? Imagine going in and telling your boss the reforms he needs to make, and then he says, what do you want? I give you half the business. You might ease up on your reform request, right? Even if it's half the kingdom. Temptation, pride, all kinds of stuff. The lust of the flesh. I'm sure that had to be raging. It's almost like save yourself. And maybe she could justify it. Well, if I had half the kingdom, then surely I can help those people, right? And yet how much is she meant to have of the kingdom? Esther says, if it please the king, let the king, verse 4, and let the king and Haman come today to a banquet I've prepared for the king. She's up to something, right? This isn't chance. This isn't God's doing something. And she says, I want to meet with you and Haman. The only person who knew how this was going to work out was who? The tables of time kind of changed. Esther's been given a chance. Esther's now calling the shots, kind of. Before it was like, you're calling the shots, you have to invite me in. But now you're telling me I've got a free pass, basically. I can do something I want to do. And imagine, and he knows something's up because he's just offered her all this stuff, and she says, the only thing I want is you and Haman to have a banquet with me. Seems kind of odd, right? I mean, if some rich guy said, hey, I'll give you half of what I have, what do you want? I just want to meet with you and someone else. They'd probably be a bit suspicious. Yeah, what you up to, yeah. And Esther replied, if it please the king. And really, see, if it please the king, that's kind of nice to say, but it's nothing to do. If it didn't please the king, God can still what? Let the king and Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for the king. Maybe she's buttering up. That's what I mean. There's so much ways you can take this. Verse 5, the king turned to his attendants and said, tell Haman to come quickly to a banquet. Nobody knows what God's doing. Nobody knows that Haman is going to die. Nobody knows that the king is going to be embarrassed and furious. Nobody knows at this point that the Jews are going to be delivered. Nobody knows that Mordecai is going to get promoted. Nobody knows that Esther is going to be a total hero. I mean, all of this stuff is still to come. And yet she starts by saying, just come to a banquet. Now again, should she have gone full leather, told everything? That's what I'm telling you. I don't know. I'm obviously just know what you know and repeating the story. Verse 5, the king turned to his attendants and said, tell Haman to come and come quickly to a banquet. You see how God sovereignly organizes everything? Because it's the king, Haman doesn't have a choice of what? Haman can't look at the king and say, not today, thanks. Even if Haman doesn't want to be there, which at the first he doesn't even really care, and he thinks it's actually, He thinks it's a good thing. It's really kind of comical. But you see, God directs Haman to be exactly where he needs Haman to be through the king who he has to obey. And so think about this. How many people are glad that Haman has the position he has? Yeah, it's brilliant because it all plays into God's plan. But you know, a few weeks earlier, no one thought Haman was a good idea. When they first hear about all of this and they see Haman and Haman's going mental because Mordecai won't bow, there's got to be a million times where you look at Haman and you say, dear God, get rid of him. Dear God, what have you done? Why have you put him in place? Why do I have to deal with him? This can't be good. This can't be your plan. And yet when you read on, Haman is God's plan. Like God, you see, if God doesn't have Haman here, if God doesn't allow all of this to happen, we don't see God. See, Haman has to be there to show off God. Who shows off God more than anybody in this story? You could almost argue Haman does. So God has him there to show him off for God's purposes and plans. And sometimes the hard things in our life are for God to show himself off to us, through us. And we want to get rid of them. And Haman has this part, and Haman has this threat, but he's really not a threat. And so he comes quickly to a banquet, and as Esther has requested. And the king and Haman went to Esther's banquet. Verse 6. And while they were drinking wine. What's that a picture of? I mean, all right, they're drinking wine, but what's it a picture of? How worried are they?
Prosperity.
Yeah, prosperity. But how worried are they?
Ease.
Yeah, ease. They're sitting having a drink and they have not a worry what? It's funny, right? We who should have no worry in the world fear, and the people who should have every worry in the world are at ease. It's just like we spoke about this morning. They've built their lives on treachery and lies and deception, and they're totally, lost people are totally content tonight going to bed without Jesus. And yet sometimes we go to bed not content, and we have him. How does that make sense? Think about that. Lost people go to bed content tonight in lies, in wealth, in who knows what. And we go to bed struggling with contentment, and we have Jesus. It's this picture of total misunderstanding. They're drinking wine. What could happen? Well, God's about to show them. Look at what it says. Now tell me, now the king's smarter. Even after a few wines, he gets it. And he says to Esther, hey, tell me what you really want. There's no way that all you wanted was to feed me and Haman. That's not why you came here. It's been 30 days since we met, or since we were to get whatever, around each other. He says, what's your request? Here we go again. Have you ever noticed that if it's like I said it is, that this offer of half the kingdom is kind of a trap and a temptation? You think it's any coincidence that the devil's repeating it? I want you to think about in your life, have you ever passed a test and then royally flunked it? Have you ever passed a temptation and then you faced it again and you messed it up? It's because when you face a temptation and you pass it, what doesn't happen is you don't ever have to face that again. You see, it would almost be easier for us if you passed the temptation and it was like, right, that's done. Never again. But here's what's difficult. It's not just saying no to temptation once. It's saying to it what? Over and over and over again. And if the lure of wealth or whatever else came to her once, now she's had it twice. And he says again, remember, I'll give you up half the kingdom. How many temptations do you think Abraham had on his 3-day journey? In his own mind, in his own spirit. How many people would advise him this is a fantastic idea? You think Sarah would have been like, this is awesome, I'll pack you breakfast. It's crazy on the outside. So What do you really want? What's your request? I'll give it to you. Verse 7. This is my request and deepest wish. It sounds a little strange. If I found favor with the king, and by the way, I think she knows by now she has. But again, look, what found her favor? Good luck? Why does Esther have favor? It's only because of God. That's the very reason she won the competition. That's the when it says, this is my request and deepest wish, if I found favor, Esther didn't have to really do, Esther had to trust the Lord and be faithful. The favor was all God's. She didn't have to look a certain way. That was all God. There's a reason she looked. And by the way, God's plan for her, he made her attractive from the beginning. Why? Because he knew she needed that. That's wild. If God needs you to be good looking, guess what? You will be. I mean, as simple as that. If God needs you to be something, he can. If I found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, again, this is all kind of talk, but it's really God. And do what I ask. Please come with Haman tomorrow to the bank. What would you do if you were the king? What would you go home and ask? Honestly, if you went to bed that night as the king, what kind of questions would be rolling around in your head? And in fact, we're going to find out that he couldn't sleep. So,
Cut this foolishness out, this banquet thing.
what is going on? Because we keep talking about banquets, and I know it's deeper than that, right? That's partly. What else would you be thinking? I mean, let's be honest. Why are you bothered with Haman? Like, of all the people, you're not throwing a party for the whole thing. You're not throwing a party for your girls. You're not throwing a party for, you're throwing a party for me and Haman. Now, because of her relationship, his relationships with Mordecai, how close do you think Esther and Haman were? Wouldn't it seem strange to you that Esther all of a sudden wants to lord Haman? I don't think Esther's been like, I love Haman. They ain't Facebook friends. They ain't texting. They're not like besties. They're not. Esther doesn't really, do you think Esther wants to, and by the way, you talk about uncomfortable. You think you have to, sometimes you have to be patient and wait your time. She's sitting there serving wine to Haman. That's got to be difficult, don't it? Watching Haman, greasy little Haman, who's done all of this stuff. And there's a lot of self-control. And she says, please come with Haman tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for you. There's another banquet number 2. And again, is this God's plan? Is she fearful and she's just putting off? I don't know. And then she says to him, but tomorrow at that banquet, what? I'll explain it to you. And we'll read in chapter 7 about the banquet and what happens. And by the end of chapter 7, Haman's going to be done. It's funny how we read circumstances and situations. Haman should have a fear of the Lord. Haman, of all people, should not be drinking wine. Haman should be running to God and asking for mercy. I mean, what part of killing God's people did he think was going to be good for him? And yet, in verse 9, look what it says. Haman left the banquet, and what does the Bible say he was? Happy. This is stupid. This is what we talked about this morning. His refuge is false happiness, false hope, false peace. He left the banquet happy. Why is he happy? Why is he happy? When do lost people get happy? When they think circumstances are what? Yeah, they're good. They're all right. They're to my benefit. Haman has no idea about sovereign God. No idea. How happy would Haman have been if you could be like, hey, dude, in not too long, you're dead. You go to the banquet and you're dead. You're done. So he leaves happy. Look at what it says. And here's the problem, whether you're lost or saved, with happiness. How fleeting is happiness? Why? Happiness is based on circumstance. Joy is based on Jesus. Happiness can be taken from you. We're not always happy. We're not. And by the way, what does it take to keep you happy? I'm guessing if you told your spouse, this is what it takes to keep me relentlessly happy, they're going to be like, no, thank you. I mean, can anybody keep you happy? Like circumstances have to be to a certain extent. I mean, how long would you take if you said, right, I'm going to be happy. I'm not going to lose my happiness. Who would win that? I mean, what would the timing be of who won that? There's no way in God's green earth any one of us would say, next week, I did it a week. Woo! We'd probably be done by the time we got to the food, right? And we'd lose our happiness because it's the wrong blooming thing they cooked, right? I mean, that's it. We're done already. It's not the temperature we're like, oh, this is not what I wanted. Our happiness would be gone already. And happiness is fleeting. Because his happiness was, he thought he was somebody. He thought the queen was elevating him. He thought, man, it's me and the king. VIP, right? The only passes in town. It's me and the king. King Jr. Yeah, King Jr., yeah. The king in waiting, right? Oh, I mean, I got it all. And he leaves the banquet, and his eyes see something that immediately eradicates his happiness. Because, and by the way, just so happens to be, right? Just so happens that Mordecai is sitting at the palace gate. And this is a picture of what the devil wants. The devil, but it's more powerful than robbing our happiness. He wants to rob us of our joy. Right? Happiness is going to come and go. We can't stop that. But you can have joy. You can. And how does the devil try and rob us of our joy? He takes our eyes off Jesus, who we're meant to be fixed on, and he puts our eyes on what? Anything else. It doesn't matter what that is, because it says to fix your eyes upon Jesus, the author and the finisher of your faith. So here's this picture, right? He's happy, but when he saw Mordecai sitting at the palace gate, not standing up, do you understand what Mordecai is? Just a vessel of who? I mean, not Mordecai, Haman. Haman is a vessel of who? The devil, right? Through Mordecai, who is really being used, like the devil is showing his character through Haman, not Mordecai. Keep saying the wrong one, but you'll figure it out. All right. He saw Mordecai sitting at the palace gate. He didn't stand up. You know, what gets people in trouble in the tribulation? What will get the devil after you quicker than anything? When you won't bow. When you refuse to worship. It's what got the 3 Hebrew boys in trouble. It's what got Daniel in trouble. It's what will get us in trouble. It's what will get you in trouble, what will get the people in the tribulation. They will refuse to bow. And Haman is so proud and has so much hostility. Remember how many people bowed to him? Everyone but the king and one other. This wretched man he thought Mordecai. But look at what it says. Not only didn't he stand, he didn't what? He didn't tremble nervously before him. Man, that verse, this is, you know that's what makes the enemy madder than mad, right? When we don't tremble nervously before him, he's all out of answers. When the devil tries to mess you up, when the devil is throwing his arrows, his darts, and you don't tremble nervously before him, you win. You win. That he won. How many times have we lost that? We do tremble nervously. And this is this picture of, I mean, I'm telling you that what you can see in Haman is a picture of, this is what the devil absolutely demands. People to stand and people to tremble nervously before him. What do you think is going to happen when Antichrist is ruling and you don't stand and you don't nervously tremble before him and you say, I don't need to fear you? Mm-hmm. And pride and arrogance and all of this. And all of a sudden, you see, this is a picture of the world too in the flesh. You've just had an invite. Your pride's just been stoked. You've just had wine. It's been a good day. But the flesh always demands more. The world offers this peace and this happiness that it can't deliver on. And everything's fine until and by the way, he leaves the banquet. He's happy. He leaves and he watches Mordecai and he won't bow and he won't get nervous. In other words, Mordecai looks at Haman and says, you have no power or authority over me. And Haman got a little upset. Is that what it says? What does the Bible say? Haman became furious. Well, here it is. Here's the exchange. Haman can be furious and God can be delighted. Or Haman can be delighted and God can be upset. That's your choice. You realize you can't please Haman and God, right? You've got to please one of them. You've got to follow one of them. So is Mordecai smarter to make Haman furious and God happy, or vice versa? Well, you know the answer to that. Haman is furious. We got to make up our mind if we're going to make God happy or the world furious. And the world furious, or the world happy and God not so happy. Peter says it succinctly. You figure it out. Whether it's better for us to obey you or God. We got to obey God. Joshua said, figure out for yourself, but as for me and my house, we got to serve the Lord. And listen, take that as a badge of honor. If the culture is furious at you, you're probably doing something right. What an amazing moment. What an amazing, and I don't know Mordecai, he's been an interesting character. Yet in this moment, this he nails, this he gets right completely. He refuses. He looks at Haman and says, you have no power over me. You know that will get you fired at a job, right? Look, you should work to the glory of God. That's not what I'm saying. But when a boss thinks he has all the power over you and can tempt you or change you, and you won't be tempted or changed, that's going to be a problem for him. Haman became furious. And verse 10 says, however, he restrained himself and went on home. Now, when it says he restrained himself, who do you really think was restraining him? It's not the time, it's not the place. Can God restrain an angry, crazy person from doing? Yeah. The Bible says that he restrained himself. You know how much self-control Haman has on his own? So he goes home and he didn't do anything about it. Then Haman gathered together his friends and Zeresh, his wife. Why? Because he thinks they're going to tickle his ears. Because sometimes when you're wrong, you want people who you know are going to tell you you're right, who don't have the guts to tell you. Haman gathered together his friends and his wife. And by the way, his friends and his wife know exactly what he's like. They know exactly. And he boasted to them. You think they're really enjoying that? Do you think? See, Haman has nothing but self-promotion. This is what the world has, and he boasts to them. Now just put yourself in the position of being his friend or being his wife. When your husband comes home and boasts to you about his great wealth and his many children, about the honors the king had given him and how he'd been promoted over all the other nobles and officials, is that something good? Is that something you want? Imagine your husband coming home and saying, I was the only one of two that got invited. Sorry about you. I mean, he's bragging. He's boasting. He's putting all his hope, all his identity and wealth in his many children. About the honors the king had given him and how he had been promoted over all the other nobles and officials. God's about, you know what the Bible says, right? Pride cometh before the... So you know before reading the story a fall's coming, right? And he's coming hard. You imagine the moment he's walking around, he thinks he's a big man. He thinks he's got the wealth and the children. And by the way, you know who gave him the wealth and the children? Do you know who gave him the honors that he had been received? Do you know who gave him the promotion? It's all God. I mean, God let it all happen. And here's the problem with it. How much credit would he give to Almighty God for any of that? Who got the credit for all of that? He did. Whenever you get the credit, you're in trouble. Verse 12. You got to laugh, right? I mean, this is just like ignorance and arrogance. And Haman added, by the way, hey guys, that's not all. Queen Esther invited only me and the king himself to the banquet she prepared for us. And she has invited me to dine with her, and the king again what? Oh man, I'm something special. Imagine if you told him you're about to go and sign your own death warrant. He goes to bed completely calm, apart from Mordecai. And she's invited me to dine with her and the king again tomorrow. But here we go again. You see, he's saying something, but what he's saying isn't reality. You've heard of little man syndrome, right? Where people say a lot because they're not very, self-confident. And the Bible shows us what's in his mind and in his heart. See, he's bragging and he's acting like he's not got a problem, but he's got a major problem. And no matter the children, and no matter the wealth, and no matter the honors, and no matter that he's like, hey, I'm getting to go to the banquet, look at what he admits. But this is all worth nothing. Wait. What do you take umbrage at that he said this is worth nothing? I mean, read what he's bragging about. What is the one thing at least that you would like, that's worth nothing? What would it be? Read the list. Well, yeah, but hold on. That's the next answer. Hold on. What I mean is, read this list. He's boasting about his wealth, his many children, the honors he's given, and the promotion. And now he said, none of that means anything to me. What one thing should you be like, dude, that's outrageous? His children. How would you like to say, hey, God, I've been given all these children, but quite frankly, they're worth nothing if this is a problem? Isn't that, that's outrageous, isn't it? All right, no one, you'll figure it out later. When you just text me later and say, that is outrageous. I've been thinking about it. All right. All of this is worth nothing.
It just goes to show how arrogant and prideful he is. Yeah?
Absolutely. And how worthless earthly things apart from your children.
He had more than anybody but the king, but it still wasn't enough.
And he's miserable. And he's miserable because he couldn't get worship by one man in the kingdom. He had hundreds, however many there were. This is all worth nothing as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting there at the palace gate. He doesn't just loathe Mordecai. He fundamentally hates him. He hates him. The world's always going to hate anyone that remotely images Jesus, that remotely shows off God. One man who wouldn't bow. You think the world like Daniel? You think the world like the three Hebrews? They don't, because it shows their lack. And what Haman has to go home and think is, how come I have all of this and it's not enough? How come I'm the second in command and this guy is getting away with this? He wants the power to do what he wants to do with Mordecai. He wants the power to, and even though he thinks he set it up, he has to wait what? He has to wait a year. Can you be furious for a year? That'll mess you up medically. It's nothing, it's worth nothing as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting there at the palace gate. God has told Mordecai to sit at the gate. And listen, in the purposes of God's plans, you've got to be of no reputation. You've got to be willing to people to look at you and think you're crazy. You've got to be willing for people to hate you. You've got to deny yourself, take up your cross, and simply what? Jesus said, if you don't love, you have to love me, and in the comparison to that love, it's going to look like you hate your own mother and father. And by the way, if you have a choice between me and your mom, guess what? It's me and it's always me. Jesus would look and say, if it's between me and your father, guess what? It's me and it's always me. Between me and your kids, it's me and it's always me. What you see, if you don't want to be Mordecai in this moment because of the hatred and the spewing and the threats, you don't really understand. Mordecai's position is a place of honor, a badge of honor. God is using Mordecai, and God is going to put... See, everybody wants to be Mordecai later. In just the next chapter, every one of us wants to be Mordecai. But you know, in order to get everything that Mordecai gets, he's got to be... You think when he was sitting there that he had any idea that Haman hated him? Of course he did. He'd already signed the edict. Verse 14. What do you get if you get a godly person going to godless people for advice? Yeah, nothing godly, right? Sometimes we go to the wrong source, right? Godly advice comes from godly people. Godless people talking to godless people produces godlessness. But godly people speaking to godly people should reproduce what? Godliness. Look, the irony in this, you know this is God. Haman's wife, Zeresh, and all his friends suggested. And by the way, if your wife's first thing is just murder him, you might want to run from her in the first place. I mean, honey, I'm having a problem with a guy at work. Well, just kill him. All right, good. Sleep with one eye open. I mean, this is crazy. I mean, I don't know what Zeresh means. I need to look it up. Maybe it means crazy. I don't know what it means. But Haman's wife, Zeresh, and all his friends. So what does that really suggest? All his friends and his wife are a little bit cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs too. They set up a sharpened, and they said, hey, Haman, set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall. And in the morning, just go to the king and simply say, why don't you just impale the dude on it? So that's our answer, right? Murder. That's our answer. Like, you're so upset, the only thing you can do is impale them on a pole. How many people have done stuff like this? How many people have been so infuriated that they resort to murder? Whether it's adultery, whether it's money, this is what lost people do. They go and take revenge. They go out and kill. And look, if you read the story, you know the total reason for this pole. God, in a twist of irony and wonderful sovereignty, you realize that there is going to be death on that pole. But it ain't Mordecai. Go and impale Mordecai on it. When this is done, and here's the lie. When this is done, you can go on your merry way to the banquet with the king. So that's all I need, right? That's going to solve everything. If I just kill Mordecai. Here's the problem that the devil has. Eventually, Apostle Paul died. I'm sure the devil was very relieved. But what does God do when Paul dies? He raises up what? See, God's always doing that. No matter who the devil runs out, no matter who dies, no matter what happens, God always has a remnant. He always has somebody. The devil's never looked around and said, God's just absent. There's always somebody. You can go on your merry way. This pleased Haman, and he ordered that the pole be set up. If he could go back, you think he'd order that pole? He's taken the advice. What do you think God's doing as he watches this unfold? Can you imagine someone in heaven or an angel or whatever saying, oh, a pole? Hang on. Just watch. Sometimes I wonder what the angels know and what they're thinking. Like, shouldn't you stop this? Just wait. You ever watched a movie and you're like, this is horrible. Oh, just wait. You know, when you've watched a movie, you don't get so into it, like you know what's coming. Like, woo! This pleased Haman, and he ordered the pole set up, and that's where we'll leave it, and we get into chapter 6. And chapter 6 is God again, even through the recording of this history and what God's going to do. Does anyone have any questions, thoughts?